Good evening, everyone. Come on, a little more energy. There was sunshine today. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Betty Cruz. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, and it's our pleasure to be partnering tonight with Randall and his team. I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
We're going to do this back and forth with Mike. Yes. I'm Randall Halle. I'm the director of the European Studies Center, and indeed very delighted that this collaboration is coming together with all of you here with us.
Yeah, great. So as you sat down, you would have found some note cards and a pen, and if you need one as the evening progresses and you want to ask questions, just raise your hands and we'll make sure that you get one, because after we have our conversation with our esteemed speakers, we're going to turn to you and get those note cards and try to move through as many questions as possible. Now, today's conversation sits at the intersection of law, history, and political philosophy, and at the center of some of the most urgent and painful questions in world affairs right now. Most of us have seen the images: Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine. We hear words like genocide and war crimes, and never again. And yet, again and again, we find ourselves watching mass atrocities unfold in real time. A natural question follows: if the world has rules against this, why don't they work?
We have this back and forth every word. And one of the things that we want to acknowledge before we begin is something direct we want to address, and that is, in the current moment, it's nearly impossible to say the word genocide without a fight, without a sense of side-taking erupting. And we want to lean into that. We're trying to model here something that I would describe as good civil discourse. The situation in Gaza in particular has generated fierce, painful, and sometimes ferocious disagreement about whether that word applies. Disagreement among legal scholars, governments, international courts, and people of profound good faith. We are not going to pretend here tonight that this tension doesn't exist. In fact, we want to begin by asking our panelists why it exists, because we believe that the intensity of the controversy is not a distraction from tonight's topic. It is actually tonight's topic.
Thank you. And I'll offer a little bit more grounding before we turn it over to our panel. But the recognition of genocide, as Randall was saying, has been accompanied by controversy from the start. What does it mean that we cannot agree on what genocide is, who gets to say so, and what follows from that determination? This is a question, as has been said, that's going to run through tonight's program. Now, to ground us, there are two frameworks that are going to anchor the conversation. The first is the Genocide Convention, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948 in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, a binding legal treaty that defined genocide as a crime under international law for the first time ever. The second is the responsibility to protect, or R2P, a more recent norm, endorsed by world leaders just in 2005, which holds that when a state fails to protect its own population from atrocities, the international community has a responsibility to act. And you'll see throughout these slides on a loop that are informing you, it's a lot of information. It's a hard and big topic that we're going to dive into together.
So we can really say that both frameworks represent genuine achievements in international law and human rights. Both have also been tested repeatedly by reality and found wanting. Understanding why is not a counsel of despair. It's the beginning of a serious conversation. And to have that conversation, we are joined here by three remarkable thinkers who bring very different but deeply complementary perspectives to this conversation.
So, to all of you, and we'll start with you, Ruth. The word genocide has become so contested in public discourse, particularly around Gaza, that many institutions and individuals are afraid to use it at all. Before we get into the legal and historical substance of that conversation that's really important, can we ask each of you to introduce yourselves, provide just some thoughts on your own backgrounds and why this word of all words has become so explosive, what's at stake politically, legally, in its application.
Thank you. So let me thank you both for organizing this event and for your insightful introductory words. My name is Ruth Mostern. I'm a professor in the history department here at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm a historian of the large scale and the long term. My last book was a book about 3,000 years of history of the Yellow River in China, the environmental relationship between a state that that seldom had the interests of its own people in mind over generations and generations of policy. And I also, right now, I'm writing a world history textbook, and so reflecting at the global scale. And I'm the, as we put it in this field, I'm the first half of history person, which means that I'm everything up to 1500. And so this is another context in which I reflect on the millennia of people trying to maintain their autonomy, trying to maintain their ancestral relationships to land, trying to maintain cultural activity, while at the same time their states accumulating more and more power and attempting to occupy more and more of the Earth's surface and the Earth's resources and entrain human labor for more and more of their activities. And so when I come into a conversation about genocide, it's very much informed not only by a story of the 20th and the 21st century, but the long conflict between people trying to engage in human flourishing in an ancestral land and states who have an interest in accumulating power and resources and human labor. I also want to add that I've been very active in the last few years in Jewish Voice for Peace and in faculty and staff for justice in Palestine. And so for me, this is not only an academic topic, it's one in which my activist commitments and my ethical commitments are very, very important to me. And so thinking about how my ethical stance as a person and my scholarly work as a historian cycle back to each other is what I'm going to be bringing to this panel today.
Well, my name is Mikhail Minakov, and I'm a political philosopher from, used to be Ukraine, now from Italy. I work in political philosophy specifically at the issues how we construct, how we create political systems, political communities, political processes. And I use the terminology that is called political creativity. And in a certain moment, we come up with the idea of law and rights. And this creates a kind of limits to what government, what state is, and creates responsibility for the state. So in genocide studies, when we look, especially since the international law is created and the crime of genocide is kind of being defined, we understand that there's something connected to this creativity when we go beyond one state. We create international law where we have the problem with sovereignty. So sovereignty is not only about making decisions, but also bearing responsibility. And in definitions and in contemporary law, it's there. But it creates a tension within each state and between the states when we look at the formula. Second, when we apply this idea of political creativity to genocide, we see that there's a long process of civilizational development. So basically, when we have convention, it's a civilizational breakthrough. And what happens with European societies, and for me, Eastern European societies are the primary object of studies, is very important. I said that I come from political philosophy, but in philosophy I stand on position of practical philosophy. So experience, the real process, realism is very important for me. And this is why I practiced in what I believed, and I worked in UN, in Kyiv office that worked on democratic governance in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. You know, Belarus is a failed case. For long it was, you know, my professors in early 90s were saying, oh, Belarus is the last dictatorship of Europe. And they were so wrong, because it was first, like after the fall of communism. And this also gives us the need to understand that creativity, political creativity, is also there on autocratic side. And there is a competition of creativities on democratic and autocratic side. Who is a better, well, more efficient in terms of making wars or providing basic services to the populations. And this competition between democracies and autocracies is growing in Europe, and genocide is part of the history.
Thank you, and I want to thank you, Randall and Betty, and for having putting together this panel. Thank everyone else who's involved and having us here to discuss these issues with you. I'm Jonathan Hayfitz. I'm a professor at Seton Hall Law School in New Jersey, and my work on genocide and international criminal law sort of grows out of my scholarly and practical engagement around issues of accountability for egregious human rights violations and mass atrocities. Before joining Seton Hall and while there as well, I was an attorney at the ACLU. I continued to work at the ACLU, with the ACLU, litigating issues around detention, torture, and abuse, and how legal frameworks can produce and respond to systematic violence. In my scholarship, I've focused a lot on international human rights law, international criminal law. I've traced the development of international criminal law from Nuremberg to the present, with particular attention on the limits of enforcement and the role of courts in shaping norms. And my current work is focused on the way legal actors construct narratives around atrocity crimes, how law frames facts or doesn't frame them, how it assigns meanings, and the way it influences public and international understandings of mass violence. And I'm particularly interested here in the gap between legal commitments and political will, and what role law and courts play when norms and rules around punishing mass atrocities go unenforced. And that's and I think what's happened, the really horrific events that are happening across the world in multiple places, involving genocide and other international law violations, really shine a light on this. So thank you.
So maybe we can stick perhaps with Jonathan, but I would like to actually begin our conversation right now with the convention and the R2P that set the standards for international law in this area. The Genocide Convention, as Betty said, actually entered into force exactly 75 years ago. So it was written in 48 and in 51 went into force. It's a question of what does it say and how is it possible to apply it? And the R2P came along then about 20-some years, 21 years ago, in 2005, 50 years after the Genocide Convention. And it's also a question of why we needed a second framework. And Jonathan, you were just sort of alluding to the problems, but I'll add into it, Mikhail and you and I also observed this afternoon that if it succeeds, we wouldn't know it on a certain level. Right? So is the narrative of it not being successful a problem of perception in some way?
So,
This is for you, but maybe everybody can see if they have a response to it.
yeah, so I think, so genocide, the Genocide Convention's landmark convention that says near universal ratification, it makes it a crime to destroy a racial, ethnic, religious or national group in whole or in part. And we can talk about how it compares to sort of the other core international crimes, but it has a very specific meaning, which sets it apart. It also has a duty to it imposes a duty to prevent as well. So you have a duty to punish and to prevent genocide. It also has a sort of through the Genocide Convention a framework where it can be enforced. Well, not enforced. Sorry. You can bring claims before the International Court of Justice. So states can bring claims, and because it's erga omnes, it means basically it's something that even states that aren't directly affected have interest as members of the international community. So that's why you will see, for example, the Gambia bringing a case against Myanmar in the International Court of Justice, or South Africa bringing the case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. So it has a number of legal dimensions. The R2P doctrine is really a kind of political commitment, and there's sort of norms around it, but it's not, it's not. It's not embodied in a treaty like the Genocide Convention, but I think it was basically informed because of the limits that have been the limits that are faced given sort of some of the structure of international law and the inability of the UN Security Council, the UN and the UN Security Council to act. So it tries to create a responsibility when there are genocide or other mass crimes going on, international crimes going on, to intervene. So I think the R2P, even if it's not binding, it's embedded in practice and it creates expectations, and it's been more successful in some contexts than others. But it's there, I think, in part because of some of the limits in enforcing the binding obligations like the Genocide Convention due to the political constraints.
I would like to add here, just when we look at this civilizational process from the convention to our R2P responsibility to protect, we see that when the convention and when the definition of genocide are done, are accepted and being implemented by the international system, suddenly you realize that the bar was so high and the definition was so strict that it was the process of recognizing certain crime as a genocide was very slow. It means prevention was almost impossible. This is why then this second step was needed. So we needed political actors, civil society, international organizations, international networks to work more in order to, on the side of prevention. And here the logic is clear. So one is court-related convention, and the other one involves other groups of interest into prevention mechanisms. However, what we can see is that, look at what the contemporary interstate system is. It's 200 plus or minus states. They are not equal. So formally they are equal under international law, but in terms of having material power and projecting this power, they divide into groups. Up the only superpower, then three great powers, then middle powers, and small states. And we divide, well, in political theory, we divide these groups by the way how they can make an influence on international processes. So when we look at these small states and middle states, they are all signees of the Roman Statute. So basically, 125 Signee states, party states, they are actually trying to prevent and fight with genocide, at least formally. But when you go further, you see that the stronger the state, the more exceptional power it wants. And here we see the problem. So in a way, there's a multilateralism as idea of shared responsibility, and R2P, the responsibility to protect, is demands from everyone in international state system, but also for civil societies, for societies at large, to act when you see the growing, the threat of genocide or other three types of mass crimes. And here comes the problem that when we see inequality in the application of these universal norms and rules. And here is the problem. We still are there, and it doesn't mean that Convention and R2P are bad acts. No, it means that we need to work further on implementation mechanisms. So the civilizational process started in 1948. It made a step ahead in 2005, but next steps are critically important.
Yeah, I think I'll speak just briefly to this question. And one of the things I've been thinking about over the last couple of days as I've been preparing for this event, and others in the room will be much more expert on this than me, is the origins of the term genocide with the Polish-Jewish refugee lawyer Raphael Lemkin. And his original definition was much more capacious, right, than the one that has been ultimately adopted. And when his potential definition came to the United Nations, the question from the British delegates was, how does this not make us culpable for colonialism, right? And the question from American delegates is, how does this not make us culpable for discrimination and lynching against the American black population? And from the Soviets was, how does this not make us culpable for the suppression of political minorities? And so the definition was changed, got a legal framework around it. Lemkin was sidelined, and he died in the late 50s as someone who was not involved with anything that subsequently happened at the United Nations, and spending his time researching the British massacre of indigenous people in Tasmania. So all of this is to say, in this context, that I think that genocide is a concept, is a very powerful concept. I am for the use of the term genocide, but thinking of it in a sense as a term that has two lives, right? One is a life that exists in court systems, that exists in admissible evidence, that exists with the kinds of structures that allow cases to be brought and cases to be prosecuted, and another that exists more capaciously, more metaphorically, as a word that really does, as I think Lemkin intended it to, name something that didn't have a name prior to that, right? But a lot of the cases in the past and the present where groups of people have been horrifically persecuted by forces of power around them, right, may or may not be admissible. Thinking, for instance, about the massacre of hundreds of thousands of real and perceived communists in Indonesia in 1965. This falls outside of the Genocide Convention, right? But the fact that we have language that we can use metaphorically, capaciously, in order to say that the targeting of a group by forces of power arrayed against it is an aspect of the world in which we live. So I want to invite us, in the rest of our time together today, to think about genocide as a term that might have both of these kinds of meanings simultaneously.
That was great. I really appreciate that all of you are identifying this kind of question of the relationship of norms and the legal system, the way that the legal system is also both driving but representative of the norms of our society. And perhaps one of the answers or one of the questions here is, why is it that the norms of society are not strong enough to be preventing genocide? But also this kind of lag time that the law does. And I really appreciate these observations, Ruth, that also the need for an imagination. Right, or the fact that our imaginations may be much larger than the way the law functions, and perhaps that also is what drives our quest for human rights, right, that they're always beyond our horizon. So sort of summing up some of the things that were said here, but I think one of the things also then you're pointing to the mass killing of people that we're talking about as genocide. And genocide doesn't happen just overnight. And that's something I was also observing right at the beginning, that we have here the 10 stages of genocide that was put forward by Gregory Stanton, professor for comparative genocide studies at George Mason. So as that slide comes up, you can catch them again, and past president of Genocide Watch. So not all have to happen with the same intensity the entire time, but they identify a complex where we can start to recognize when genocidal activity is beginning.
In the simplest of terms, who should get to decide or officially declare that a genocide is occurring? To anyone who would like to take that.
Well, maybe I'll talk about it this way, right? I mean, because when we have conflicting definition, there might be conflicting underlying legal definitions, but we have what's in the Genocide Convention, the debate over how broadly that should be read. But when we have more even conflicts over facts, right? Is genocide occurring? How does the Genocide Convention, right, the law, get applied to what we see on the ground? That's multiplied, I think, now in 2026 by social media, by disinformation, misinformation, right? It becomes sort of difficult to assess beyond whatever definition disputes might have over the actual legal definition, how far it reaches, just difficult to assess whether or not, what's happening factually. And so typically when we have these types of disputes, it tends to be individual by courts, right? That's one way. They're not the only way, but there's sort of one way of deciding sort of like epistemological truth or what actually happened. The Genocide Convention is unique compared to, say, other types of atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes of aggression, or crimes against humanity, in that there is jurisdiction, right? States parties to the Genocide Convention have agreed to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice to decide questions of genocide. So, given the limits on other tribunals, right? Given the limits, which I could talk about on the International Criminal Court, which has, none of the largest powers, Russia, United States, and China are part of, among others. There's been attention focused on the International Court of Justice, and so maybe outsized attention. And this goes to the sort of scope or the definition, and it also goes to the prevention component. Because so what's happened is there's litigation, for example, over in Gaza over whether Israel is committing genocide that was brought by South Africa, and a number of other states have joined, and so. As to the that's where the the disputes or whether or not this is genocide or not will be decided at least by a court. It may be rejected. I'm sure if the court rules against Israel will reject it. But at least there'll be a court decision. One one problem which you identified is by the time the ICJ decides something, there will have been, so many lives and destruction will have occurred. So one interesting thing that's happened in the genocide litigation is the effort to use to seek provisional measures, that is sort of interim relief, right? So that's the rulings that the ICJ has issued thus far. There have been a series of them in which they've ordered Israel to not commit genocide, in its most to preserve evidence of any genocidal acts, not to make statements inciting genocide, and in its most far-reaching ruling, not to proceed, as I read it, not to proceed with what was then the attack on Rafah. Now, this hasn't been enforced. To what extent it's influenced Israel's conduct of the war is debated, but that is an effort, right? So that's where the Genocide Convention, through litigation, has come in to try to address something in a more of a preventive mode. The other complications, because the Genocide Convention, because the ICJ, its jurisdiction is only over genocide, there are other horrible crimes like war crimes or crimes against humanity, which are simply just fall outside of the scope of the convention and the scope of the jurisdiction. And so there's a debate over whether something is genocide or not. But if it's not genocide, if it's only ethnic cleansing, right? That's which is a horrible crime on its own. There's in some sense kind of an outsized, I think, emphasis on genocide in that respect, because it puts all the weight on proving something's genocide when you have these other crimes occurring, and it's been said there should be no hierarchy of international crimes, although I think for purposes of sort of narrative purposes there is. I mean, there's something about the label of genocide that has certain weight, which is the last thing I'll say here is, and that's why I think where you have litigation like the Gaza litigation in the ICJ, or like the litigation involving Myanmar, the effort, the courts and the mobilization of law by actors to try to focus attention and bring cases to court does have a narrative impact, and potentially can create pressure and place pressure on states like Israel or Myanmar that are accused of committing genocide, as well as the states like United States, Germany, which has been also sued by Nicaragua in the ICJ, that are supporting for supporting the genocide. So I think that the litigation becomes a way for a lot of these issues to kind of play out and be contested, even if there's sort of actual enforcement is distant, if it ever happens at all.
Good. No, that's okay. And there's many things that we could pursue there. You can ask follow-up questions, but I also think it's interesting. The responsibility to protect should be kicking in, but it doesn't, and it speaks to part of the reason. Part of what you're describing, Jonathan, is also something that Mikhail also alluded to in the differentiation of power, the superpowers, the mid-powers, and the application here that we're talking about is often a situation in which, say, African leaders, African countries are prosecuted outsized numbers, versus then the United States will never be, as
right.
Ruth was sort of pointing to for us, because they're not signatories. So where the application is also part of the global north versus global south, sort of in the considerations. Can we think then about some concrete cases here? And Mikhail, I would ask you, in general, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Can you talk to us about how that's transformed international law and in effect, your perspective on the situation in Ukraine in this conversation?
Well, thank you. Ukraine actually made or forced international law to recover the core prohibition of aggression. So basically, that's very important for us to understand. Yes, we see military operations around the world happening. But in Ukrainian particular case, resistance plus smart international law behavior of government made it possible to actually restore the sensitivity of international law and interstate system towards the problem of aggression or the crime of aggression. So I'm looking into the UN General Assembly's resolution ES 11.1, where basically what we see, Russia's attack was identified as aggression. So it makes very important statement that despite the fact that this country has, or this state has, a veto in Security Council, through General Assembly, there is an important statement made. Well, after that, we have International Court of Justice and International Court, ICC, Criminal Court, both making very important acts that will be also precedents in future. So Ukraine kind of, by resisting and by using international institutions, creates many important precedents for future other countries countering the aggression. So ICJ ordered already in March 22 that Russia must suspend military operations and that they are criminal in nature. So that was very important. And then ICC issued arrest warrants on Putin and several other senior Russian officials, which proved that even major power and its officials can be named as aggressor, and very important steps can be made. Well, and also in all this case, we also can see that universal norms and unequal enforcement are still in place. Despite all the decisions or acts, the work goes on. And here the problem is there. So, and there's also one more important issue. It's before 22. So basically, Ukraine exposed a deeper pre-war failure to prevent. Between 2014 and 22, there were 8 years of opportunities to actually prevent this war happening, and it didn't happen. So here we can see that there are limitations here. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd like to direct the next question to Ruth. So Sudan has been a slow-burning catastrophe for years with relatively little sustained international attention. What does history tell us about why some mass atrocities generate global mobilization and others simply don't?
Yeah, thanks. So I think we've already had some good conversation about the fact that even though all states are equal, right, in the eyes of the United Nations, that does not mean they are equal in the realm of global power, right, and the realm of global authority. And, thinking about this sort of framework of multilateralism, multinationalism, the United Nations, international law that we're bringing to this panel directs us into thinking about states. Right, and thinking about states as essentially being equal in their sovereignty and equal in their vote at the United Nations. But in fact, we live in a world where states are highly unequal, right, where the effects of colonialism continue to resonate through the world, where non-state actors, right, refugee and migrant peoples, indigenous peoples, right, don't fall neatly into a world of thinking about states and a world of thinking about multilateralism. So I think that's part of the context here. And then also that, therefore, at least from the perspective of the United States, right, the places in the world that are not significant to geopolitical consideration of the United States government simply don't get the same attention as places that are. And I think that's what brings us to the example of a case like Sudan, right, where the relevance to American political power of what happens in Sudan is relatively low, and therefore American people, even people of conscience, tend to hear little about this event. I also want to reflect on this in the context of history, since I'm here as the historian on the panel, and thinking about, and I guess this sort of also goes back to the earlier question about sort of where's the starting point, where's point zero in making an accusation, a credible accusation of genocide, and in the case of what is happening in Sudan, right, reasonably rooting that in two different places. One being British Egyptian colonial policies in the first half of the 20th century, right, which directed political authority towards the populations, the majority Arab populations that lived in the Nile Valley, and de-investing in the populations that lived outside the river region, and with very long-term consequences that resonate in power relations today and resonate in political capacity today. And so that's one important way of thinking about that genocidal case in particular. Another is climate. And when we talk about things that are difficult to bring into focus, one is the fact of genocide and crimes against humanity in countries that are outside of the geopolitical vision of the great powers. Another is the global story of peoples around the world whose displacement and violence, lack of flourishing, competition with one another over scarce resources is happening because of drought. And Sudan is one of those places. And when we think about the conditions for genocide, understanding the fact that there are very, very desperate people who cannot farm, who do not have access to water, who are trying to make their way in a world of profound climate change is really important. And we can talk about other places where that's happening, in Rwanda, right, in Central America, during the Assad regime in Syria, right? There's so many cases in the world where the most horrific acts of human anguish and violence and displacement are occurring with a drought and climate and starvation signature underneath. And I think that's something that's also really important to keep in our conversation.
Thank you for that. So speaking of climate and the language that's been emerging, we do hear of ecocide. We also hear of femicide, cultural genocide, epistemicide. Should the current definitions be expanded to include these terms? Could the current legal framework actually accommodate a broader understanding? And that's for whomever would like to take that. And then I'd like to go a little deeper on cultural genocide specifically.
Well, I'll take the first part. Yeah, I mean, there's always a desire to push the normative envelope and expand the definition of crimes to cover more. I think it's appealing. I think the concern is that even within the existing crimes, there's so many obstacles to enforcement by the ICC or through by the ICJ in the way it operates in international courts as well as domestically. I mean, domestic courts can also prosecute, and often do prosecute, international crimes. So, so I think that's the tension, right? And so I think and so if you talk about expanding the definition of genocide, right? To include femicide. I think that's again, it's normatively appealing, but I think there'll be, I think there's political resistance to expanding the convention at all. Amendment's procedurally difficult, politically unlikely, and there is, the one workaround is that at least gender-based violence can be prosecuted as crimes against humanity and war crimes, right? The ICC has recognized sexual violence and gender prosecution as core crimes. The ICTR links sexual violence to genocide, right? Acts of sexual violence could constitute acts in furtherance of genocide. So I don't, and as to environmental harm, if it's environmental harm that's directed at the, as a means of harming a civilian population, it can be a crime against humanity. But not environmental harm as such. And so I think, as to ecocide, I think there is, and there's compelling reasons to try to expand the normative envelope, and through international criminal law or other treaties, the risks on the other side of just I think of compliance and pushback. And so I don't think codifying something into a treaty or an obligation will necessarily equal a solution.
Maybe I would make some demand or request for self-limitation in expanding the definition of genocide. We already made a risky step in R2P. It became elastic. It became also used by many propagandas, not only by truly activism-driven or the case-driven activism. And this is very important. So maybe if we follow the ecocide or gender-based mass crimes, then we have to follow the path that we already know, create definitions and mechanisms of both prevention, recognition, and implementation of the implementation mechanism. So far, what we see that there's also a lot of games, indecent games around the word of genocide. It's also there. Let's face it. So we should remember about this shadow of overexpanding of the terminology, and then cum grano salis. So with some reservation, we should think about a stronger, more effective system that would create actually a possibility to prevent mass crimes, not only genocide, but other types of crimes. And we definitely see them. And I would like to also kind of historical step here. Sorry for this, but maybe it also will give us a perspective.
No, that's Ruth.
Just look. The first books, first treatises about war and peace, when they appear in China, in India, on the European continent, the first books are about wars, how to wage wars, how to make them effective, how to win. Peace comes very late, and especially towards this Enlightenment period. But Enlightenment and tragedy of Enlightenment was connected, and that was the beginning of our conversation. What were your words? Rules. And why do we not implement rules? In Enlightenment, we thought our human beings are rational. They are autonomous, ethical subjects. Are they? Just think, how many rules did you break today? Well, we did, didn't we? And we will look at the history of humanity, and there are a lot of genocidal actions. Old Testament. Some surahs in Quran describe the same. So you basically see that history is full, and memory, social memory, cultural memory about genocidal actions are there. We mentioned Egypt. It's there as well. And then we also have a better side of humanity in place. In southern Czechia, approximately 50,000 years ago, three humanities still live together. So Neanderthals, Cro-Magnons, and Denisovians. 10,000 years together. And we almost do not find skeletons with the signs of the wars. So 10,000 years of probably peaceful coexistence, not only of different tribes, not different races, different humanities, so genetically different, and even mixed kids are found. So there are both possibilities in humanity. We bear both, rules and breaking them. So we need to create institutions, creativity. We need to create institutions that support the better in us and in our collective organizations, states included. So maybe prevention should start with the institutional design at even this level.
I don't know, Ruth. He just threw the gauntlet.
Right,
down.
no, really, you went back 50,000 years. Oh my gosh, congratulations. You beat me. So I'm feeling really liberated right now by not being a lawyer and therefore not having to think about these questions through the lens of the practical questions of what kinds of frameworks make sense in a court of law. And in that context, thinking about these questions of ecocide, memoricide, right, the destruction of, as a historian, anything that's about the destruction of books, the destruction of documents, the destruction of records, the destructions of the architectural patrimony of the most beautiful and extraordinary creative manifestations of human existence, right? There may or may not be a term in the court of law that focuses specifically on those horrific acts of destruction to individual people and to our shared humanity. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on this panel naming and contemplating some of those events and focusing, for instance, on the fact that one of the first things that happened in the Israeli invasion of Gaza was the destruction to the ground of the central archives in Gaza City. This is 150 years of records of people's genealogies, of people's property relationships, of information about people's homes and farms and ancestry, the things they've owned, the taxes they've paid, the way they've been tethered to themselves and the ground and one another, and a succession of states. And when it is time for Gaza to rebuild, all of that information will have been lost. Another one of the first things to be destroyed was the 1.5 million books and documents at the Islamic University of Gaza, which included not just recent books from the recent past about the history and culture of Palestine, but books, a rare book collection, right, unparalleled rare book collection in the region that is what would allow anyone in the future to be able to study and understand history that reaches back in that region of the world for hundreds and thousands of years. And understanding some of these acts of destruction not just as being a genocide of individuals in the moment, right? Not just a destruction of the lives and culture and livelihood and flourishing of people alive right now, but in the destruction of books and records and documents and buildings, also a destruction that is a severing of the lives and experiences of people hundreds and thousands of years before ourselves, the destruction of archaeological sites. We haven't named the war that is happening right now in Iran because it's not sort of narrowly in topic for today, but I want to name the destruction and the damage that has occurred to dozens of UNESCO heritage sites in one of the most historically and archaeologically significant parts of the world. A level of destruction that I do not think we are even able to take stock of right now. Right, the severe damage to the gorgeous mosque at Isfahan, right, the Safavid era mosque from the 1400s, one of the most gorgeous sites lined with bright, look it up, right, lined, I mean, just like these beautiful cobalt blue tiles lined with art, soaring to the ceiling, full of light. is one of the sites that has been seriously damaged in this war. So I don't know what a convention looks like that puts events like that at the center of our consciousness, right? I think this is something that probably exists outside of a world of courts of law, but that I hope in that sort of, capacious, expanded, what do we talk about when we talk about genocide, right? How do we use, genocide as a kind of springboard of our imagination into thinking about what systematic destruction looks like? I want us to keep those kinds of events in our minds as well.
Just to signpost, Ingrid is collecting your cards. If you have questions, we'll start taking them up and sort of turning it over to the audience, as it were, to drive some of our conversation now. But I want to, I think, just linger for a moment in this conversation, because I think it's really bringing a lot to the fore. And Ruth already identified to us that there is a history to genocide as a term itself, right? And part of the reason why there's a history to words is because humans act, things come into the world, they don't yet have names, they're new to us. The point of emergence needs to be named, and it is likely once things have happened, they will happen again. And I'm wondering if we could say a little bit more about this. I'm looking at Jen Keating, who works on the destruction of the Irish archive by the British, and accomplished exactly what you're saying, that these are practices that are long histories, but the naming of them. And so the expansion of ways to describe things seems to me to bear, and to be important for us to be able to move forward in anticipation that we're in a world in which new technologies, new mechanisms of destruction are on the horizon, different ways of destroying peoples and their memory, and the memory of those peoples. And indeed, I really think this kind of question of culture is something that has been a red question throughout the history of the Genocide Convention up to the present. Is the destruction of people and their bodies, or is it the destruction of culture? And does anybody want to return to this and add some further reflections on that?
Again, in recent 2 centuries, we see how several waves of political systems were destroying the epistemic foundations of different cultures, especially indigenous cultures, local cultures in this state building. So imperial world first. Empires that were erasing ethnic groups, local groups, but then nationalism of the second half of 19th century. Local communities had to become national communities, and this also was the process. It's best described on the example of France. There's a huge literature about this, but also in Eastern Europe it was happening. But then you look at what's going on right now. You asked me about Ukraine, but if we look at cultural destruction, cultural sites destruction, well, the statistics, these terrible statistics that you can read in UN report as of March 26, so quite recent, 525 sites only from the UNESCO list that is destroyed. And mind it, we are talking about Ukraine, Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia. These are the territories where the World War II, the total war, went on twice. In Ukraine, during World War II, 82% of all buildings were destroyed. So imagine vast destruction. So those little things that survived are being destroyed today systemically. And that's also part of this, what's going on. In Ukraine, well, and we're talking about UNESCO list, the real destruction list is much wider. In Ukraine, you see that some groups of scholars and activists are working together in order to document the destruction. So at least not to forget what is done. And then later, when the court proceedings will be there, is to be done. But still, prevention, and this is hardcore politics and diplomacy should come. We should not allow these kind of wars to happen again.
No, I mean, I agree with both of you. I mean, I think just to clarify, destruction of cultural property, it can be a war crime. I don't think law should be certainly not limit the discussion, but it can be. It is a war crime, and there was prosecution by the ICC for destruction in Mali, and that creates sort of norms, so that it can help build. I think it can be part of the way to discuss these issues. But I also I just want to also just echo what you said before about aggression, because I just think it can't be stressed enough, even though the topic is genocide. The aggression at Nuremberg, right? The tribunal in Nuremberg, they described aggression as a crime that contains all other crimes within it, right? So I think a lot of all these other crimes you see, including genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, including destruction of cultural property, are a result of aggression, and what I think is perhaps among the most concerning developments recently has been the further erosion of the limits on aggression in the UN Charter, right? That acts that use of force it's illegal unless sanctioned by the UN Security Council, approved by the UN Security Council, or in self-defense. And we saw that in Ukraine with a naked act of aggression by Russia, which, by the way, was, I think, justified, and that's a concern about R2P, in R2P language. One of the rationales was they were going in to protect Ukraine against genocide, right? Russians against genocide, and that was actually the issue that was litigated before the ICJ.
This is why we needed General Assembly decision.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that was, and I think now certainly, and we referred to it with Iran, right? Clearly the U.S. violated the UN Charter. There was no argument for self-defense. There was no Security Council approval. Put aside the violation of the U.S. Constitution, and you have the U.S. openly proclaiming, President Trump openly proclaiming the commission of war crimes, destruction of a civilization, right? I mean, it's the erosion of these norms. I think most prominently the norm of aggression is concerning, and that ultimately is, I think, connected and weakens protections against genocide.
I think I just want to really briefly say that norms against aggression have been pretty short-lived, right? I mean, to the extent that they have existed, this is something that existed for a couple of generations in the 20th century, right? And so, in that context, thinking about sort of continuing to wrestle with how we think about long-term violence, slow violence in this context of cultural genocide. I was at a talk earlier today about the history of the Cherokee Nation, the Cherokee people from Western North Carolina, Tennessee, right, Northern Georgia today, and people who have been, for the most part, dispersed far from their homelands, dispersed from their places of ancestral memory, whose language is lost or maintained only by a very, very small number of people. It's nobody's first language, right? And thinking about how we kind of square, right? And this is as a result of activities that began in the 18th century, right? And wondering, and this is really just kind of a question for us all. I don't have a good answer here, but how we think of these acts of the destruction of culture, the destruction destruction of cultural memory, the loss of language, the loss of the ability to find one's way in a physical space of ancestry, right? The loss of a connection to the land, to the ancestral places, to the names of those places, to entire kinds of cultural connections and language, right? But something that, although it is still resonating today, this is a 2026 story of cultural survival, but at the same time, also a story of cultural destruction, right? Something that if it were happening today, and I guess it's in that I'm not trying to be disputatious when I'm like, these norms are short-lived, right? But that in the 18th century, right, nobody colonizing North America was worried about whether the massacre of Cherokee people, the displacement of Cherokee people from their homeland was something that was a violation of international law. And so how to tell that story as a long-term story, but also to the extent that it's about living, surviving people trying to flourish in 2026, how we bring a story like that into the topics that we're talking about here today is not very clear to me, but something that I also hope can be part of our conversation.
Thank you for that. Looking to some of the questions from the audience, and we've received quite a few, and a few of you put like 5 questions on a note card. It's pretty impressive. So we'll do our best, but I'm clustering a few here. This seems to speak more to the 10 stages of genocide and some of the language and actions that have been referenced, but as it relates to mass killing, why isn't that enough? As it relates to ethnic cleansing, Jonathan, this one was directed to you, with the 10 stages of genocide, how can we say ethnic cleansing doesn't count, or it's only ethnic cleansing is the question that was noted here. And then another one that I'm pulling in again on this topic is, how is it even possible that ethnic cleansing is sometimes not genocide? So if you can lump those.
Oh, I'll just do that. Ethnic cleansing. And when I say it's only, that's the response. And I don't mean to condone it. I'm just saying that if your defense is, well, it's not genocide, it's only ethnic cleansing, I think you're in a very bad place, right? But that's because of the definition of genocide, and that's what. And there's debates over what the interpretation, but it means the destruction of a group in whole or in part based on the factors, the limited factors. And so, if this came up in the context of in the Balkans, whether it was genocide or not, and there was only a limited finding of genocide in Srebrenica, but the rest of it was deemed, ethnic cleansing was basically you're essentially not trying to destroy the group, you're just moving them or driving them from a particular land. It's still a crime against humanity. It's not genocide. But again, to me, I think that's on the one hand, maybe that you can look at it, that's a problem with the limited definition of genocide, but I think it's also a problem putting too much weight on genocide when you have something like that is ethnic, that's still ethnic cleansing. There are, the arguments though that it is genocide in Gaza, it doesn't mean they're not arguments that it's not, and very good arguments that it is genocide in Gaza. So for example, Omar Bartov, leading historian of the Holocaust and genocide scholar, points out if it's not ethnic cleansing anymore because you're trying to eliminate the basically aspects of life or civilian life that make the ability of the group to exist possible. You couple that with some of the incitement to genocide type rhetoric, and it's genocide. Just because it's not the gas chambers, it doesn't mean of the Nazis doesn't mean it can't be genocide. I just meant to say that it's the problem, the concern is. By putting everything on genocide, is it can crowd out other types of atrocity crimes that may not be genocide. And I understand the reasoning for genocide, the reason why people go to genocide and put the weight on it is both legal, political, social, right? It has because of the sort of triggers, the legal triggers, a little pressure you can bring to bear if it's genocide. And I just think because of the narrative value, because of the way it echoes, right, within the public space. So genocide, right, the supreme crime, as opposed to, war crime, right, that seems lesser. But there is, as you said, there's no hierarchy of international crimes.
I have also, and indeed, very dense writing here, very good. But you just responded to also one of the questions that was posed on that card I have. But I think what I'm also seeing is a concern about, so we're talking about the language and the possibility of the language being used in a way to promote activity, and the allusion to R2P and Russia actually using the responsibility to protect as grounds for its own action is something that's very interesting for us to consider. Also, if it wasn't already said, that in effect the R2P begins with Bill Clinton looking for justification to bomb in Serbia. And so it has this kind of nefarious origin, perhaps, or the possibility, and it goes to the question of power dynamic. I'm really extending one of the questions here, but I'm wondering what we're not necessarily talking about explicitly is this question of multilateralism, and I think that this is also something that's inflected or reflected in the questions here. How can we get states to work together, or is it something that the grassroots has to be active? I'm wondering.
Well, maybe it's not either or, it's and. Again, there's a shadow behind this terminology that we use. So make R2P definitely widened the term genocide, and it provides political actors, not always good-willing, to misuse the term. Yes, in Kremlin case or in Serbia case. And here I would say that when you look at human rights networks, they're hugely important. And they're very inconvenient for governments, for states. And you can always see attempts to criminalize these groups. Recently, several weeks ago, a very important person for me, my mentor for many years, died. He was an old Soviet-time dissident, Semyon Gluzman. He was a psychiatrist who denied writing the diagnosis for another dissident, saying that he's crazy. And he faced the persecution, he was imprisoned. And then in independence time in Ukraine, he was the head of this very inconvenient organization that constantly fought with government in courts or through public debate. And he had this huge respect also among the political players. So these figures like him are important, but they cannot. We need both these kind of people, activists, organizations around them, and states and governments that are controlled. Well, when we talk about governments, about states, these are huge organizations, and they are about power. It's coercion and extortion. This is basically at heart of every state. So what we are doing with liberal law inside and international law on international niveau, we force them to behave. So basically what we are doing, we are catching leviathans and put them on chain. And this is, well, I think it's quite fair to describe it in these terms. So if we kill leviathans, then behemoth comes. So Hobbes described it well. So behemoth is the civil war with genocides, mass atrocities, and everything terrible, so the worst in us. And the most reasonable solution is to create Leviathan. But then Leviathan takes away freedom, and they start fighting, and they create genocides again. So here is to keep states. Well, we need states to keep the political order, but we need chain of law, supreme law, divided power in order to control, to put the leviathans on chain.
Yeah. So I'm not disagreeing with my colleagues. I do not trust states ever to protect the interests of the most vulnerable people, either within their borders or outside of their borders. And I do not believe that many states in the world have the capacity, even if they wanted to stand up to more powerful states or corporations, right? Nigeria cannot stand up to Shell Oil, right? The reason why, to go back to ecocide, right? The reason why the delta of the Niger River is a ecological disaster is because Shell Oil is more powerful than that government, right? And so, absolutely, states exist in the world, right? That's a fact on the ground, right? And absolutely, states control a lot of resources, a lot of weapons, right? A lot of ability to do violence, right? And therefore need to have legal structures around them to the extent that that's possible. But in that context, I also want to name, as we're talking about inequality, right, global inequality between states and corporations, within states that identify which constituents they are interested in protecting rather than others, able to protect rather than others, right, that a world of international law is only one piece of a story of structural inequality that also needs to be part of this conversation. And let me say that sometimes that may mean that behemoth is what will bring about liberation, right? And I say this with hesitancy because there is no case where war is not a horrific outcome for vulnerable people. But the reason why many countries in the world have decolonized is not because of international law, it's because of movements of armed liberation. And I want to leave space for civil society, but also for the reality that some of the violence, but also some of the justice and liberation that exists in the world has come about because of armed movements against state power.
Some debate then. Not that I'm advocate of states. However, today during lunch we had a brainstorm to actually find good examples of prevented genocides. So it's very difficult because no sensation, almost no documentation. It didn't happen. So how can we sell it? How can we identify it? So I asked another senior colleague and mentor who worked in UN for 40 years, could he help me to find a case? And it was Kenya of a post-electoral situation in 2008. Basically, there was like genocide, at least ethnic cleansing in preparation as a result of elections. And then somehow states worked out, and again, because of this Kenya, small state, probably there was kind of balance of interests of big players, and there was no transnational corporate interest. And then it worked. So state is a terrible organization, but others can be worse.
So I'll ask this question as bluntly as it's written here, just to get to the heart of multilateralism. Agree or disagree? Multilateralism is dead.
Disagree?
Why?
Yeah, well, in normative, at normative level, multilateralism is there. We still have UN. We have General Assembly. We cannot make step back and close UN. Just imagine the world without it. So, in a way, we should move further, yes, definitely. Well, I came from Europe, sorry, bringing European case here. Well, we have European Union. It got stuck. At a certain moment, the further integration stopped. And it's already more than 10 years as this project really stagnates. So in a way, if we don't make progress, the project of union can fall. And for European continent, it means return to the wars among the nations. So EU, UN, multilateral organizations are alive, then is insufficient. We need to move. Compare, well, remember League of Nations, very inefficient. UN is more efficient, but maybe third step is necessary. And again, implementation institutions. That's what is needed in order to better multilateralism.
Yeah. I agree. I just think it may take a different form. I think, who knows what will happen with the war in Iran, but I think it will change. I think the U.S.'s role is changing, but I think increased role of smaller states and different forms of alliances. But I don't think it's dead. I think it's going to just take, a different form.
I guess what I would say is that anything that is alive lives in some ecosystems and not others. Yes, right? Fish live in the sea, polar bears live on the land, right? And so my answer to the question of whether multilateralism is alive or dead is whose multilateralism, right? For whose purposes, right? Benefiting whom and excluding whom, right? And so, right, the non-aligned movement of the 1950s, right? The origins of third worldism is not alive, right? The Union of African States, the Organization of African States, not really ever funded enough, supported enough in order to really flourish and create a shared continental front against colonialism, right? So we can look at some multilateral institutions that maybe are doing okay, but whether multilateralism has ever benefited all of the peoples of the world, right? Whether a decolonial and post-colonial world has ever really fully come into existence in a way that is protective of most of the world's peoples is another question.
So I think it's interesting. Also, if you knew Mikhail a little bit, you would know that he's whiplashing between being the Kantian scholar that he is and the Hobbesian scholar that he doesn't want to be. And I think that that's also sort of a thing that's happening here on this panel. And I just want to reflect back to everybody that it's interesting to me because on the one hand, Ruth has this long history of right? But on the other hand, there is something here that's also about progress and the hope in progress. And I constantly think to myself, oh, you are so jaded, and then I find myself actually hopeful. And then I'm surprised, wow, why did you get caught up in being hopeful again? You shouldn't be. But Ernst Bloch said that this principle of hope is actually that which is the key to utopia. It's not the place that you'll arrive at, but it's the thing that drives us forward in that journey that we're on, and motivates the armed resistance when everything else is impossible. That people don't do things because they know they're going to be destroyed, but they do things because there's hope that their actions will have some futurity to them, whether or not they continue to live. I have a number of questions here that are great questions. One of them, though, is really about this prevention of genocide, to stop genocide. And the concrete question is, are amnesty deals worth it to stop genocide, even if it means the actors aren't prosecuted? And this is perhaps an interesting thought experiment, but it goes to this question of, would we know? Do we know when a genocide is being prevented? Should we go all the way to keep the worst from happening by accepting the not so bad, or the worst from happening by accepting the bad?
I don't have I think it's a ethical dilemma. I think it's hard to sort of determine it. I mean, I think there's a legal answer, which would be, no, there should be no impunity. And I think impunity is a slippery slope, and so part of me supports that. I don't know, but I think it's ultimately ethical and almost unanswerable because you don't really know in the end.
Well, maybe if we analyze the case of Rohingya, right? So the ethnic cleansing, genocidal actions started. So we know who started, which government, which institutions, but then it was interrupted due to, again, states, bigger states' involvement in stopping it. But it did not, it prevented the escalation and further destruction of this group, ethnic group. But then the perpetrators of the first acts of crime were not punished. Even more, some of them continued their political careers, military careers, and so on. So is it justice or not? And here we come, and another philosophical, but also issue what humans are. We not only break rules, but we also live with many concepts which are problematic, and one of them is justice. So, for example, you said I'm Kantian philosopher. Yes, Kant taught us that in order to understand where reason ends is to see antinomies. So we have statements that are true even though they contradict each other. So if we apply antinomy to justice, we can say there is no justice, and this is why we have to fight for it. One true statement, ethically true. The other one is there is no justice, and this is why we have to fight for it. Mm-hmm. So it shows that if we talk about ethical principles of human being, we end in certain moments, we are limited, we have to accept it. And moral dilemmas, true moral dilemmas, do not have right outcomes, right decisions. We make decisions. So we make decision to kill 3 instead of 10 with the running carriage, right? But we're still responsible for the murder of 3. And impunity doesn't exist in politics, in the world that is divided by states. So basically, since 20th century, all the surface of planet is divided by states, and we have to deal with that.
So I have 2 very specific questions I'm going to ask at the same time. As we're getting close to time here, I think it'd be remiss not to ask these. So whoever would like to take them. The first is, you've mentioned numerous times Gaza and the destruction caused by Israeli troops, but you did not mention once the 7th of October. How come? And the other question is, U.S., Israel bombed universities in Tehran, Iran. Why do universities in the U.S. and Europe stay silent?
Well, I can start with the second. European universities don't keep silence. Well, I was teaching last year in Germany, and my German German, French, Turkish students were not silent. There is a huge solidarity. Maybe you don't hear that. And with the Israel-Gaza problem, at least for me, the blood and the pain of both sides is here in my heart.
So to start with the second question, the movements at universities in the United States have been crushed, right? It's not that there is not a movement of solidarity and conscience visible in the streets at American universities right now because students are not eager to support global solidarity, but because the people, including individuals right here at the University of Pittsburgh who attempted to do so, are facing felony prosecution as we speak. Not unlike students at many other campuses in the country. Students, again, including students right here at the University of Pittsburgh, have had to flee the country because they are immigrants who fear prosecution. Again, not unlike universities elsewhere in the country. And so, this is right, sort of tying, I think, back to a number of themes that have come up in our conversation this evening about the sort of relationship between what can be accomplished through state power, right? Ways in which we need to think about states as potentially lawful and benign actors, and as states as actors that are very, very concerned about their own populations as well as populations around the world, acting for liberation and acting as critics of those states.
Yeah, I'm going to do both. On the second, I agree with them, and I represent non-citizen students who've been facing deportation based on protesting what's happening in Gaza. There's been a real chill. And I think there's, at universities, there is large public protests. I mean, there is a significant amount of protest. One of the issues in the U.S. is there's just so much. Right, it's the Steve Bannon, flood the zone. There's so much. There's the war, but there's so many different things that it's hard to focus, and I think that's been deliberate. But I do think there is protest. There should be more, absolutely. As the first, of course, I mean, October 7th was horrific. It was certainly, they were war crimes. They were, and there's. Genocide, potential genocide as well in terms of the intent, but that doesn't justify what happened on the other side. I think, my view, what Israel's done is way out of proportion to what happened, and the ICC did indict leaders of Hamas. They were killed, but they were indicted. So I don't think at this point in time, I don't think that's not really to me where the most constructive focus should be.
All right, Betty just whispered to me, can we end on a positive question? We need to pick a different topic to do that, I think.
I'll say something positive.
We want to thank our panelists for really, and as I said at the beginning, that leaning into the hard conversations is rewarding and important for us, because there were many, many things, unexpected turns in this conversation that really have also helped me think more profoundly about what's going on. I also want to take a moment to thank Ingrid, Ryan, Brian, who are here behind the scenes, making sure that everything happens. Thank you for doing that work for us. And then thank you all for being part of the discussion this evening. I really appreciate that, and I look forward to future ones. And I just want to actually potentially say that, one of the things that I have some notes here, and it's borne out here, that in our conversation, this imagination of a better world versus the world that we have, the disjoin between the intent of the Genocide Convention and what we can understand or read out of R2P, versus what the reality is not a place where we have to be content to say that, but we have to drive it forward. And I do think that if there's an incitement to a call to action, it is precisely at the grassroots level that the question about protest, about action, the sooner you begin, the more likely you are to stop the other things that might come. And those 10 stages that we've seen flashing up here, each one of them is something to be attentive to at the particular moment where they are not hot. And many of them in the United States are already very hot. Right? And that's something for us to consider. Never Again was never meant to be a eulogy. It was meant to be a commitment. And whether that commitment is honored is, in the end, not just a matter of law or policy. It's a matter of whether enough people refuse to accept that it cannot be. Thank you.